Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Geraldine and I grew up in Houston in Texas in the 80s era, a single daughter of two elderly parents who were literally old enough to be my grandparents. My mother gave birth to me at 53 years old, and at the time she believed her enlarged distended abdomen was a result of rather unfortunate menopause belly fat. But when her waistline increased exponentially beyond what was customarily considered reasonable weight gain for the menopause, she believed she had some kind of catastrophic cancerous stomach tumour. I gather she and my dad waited with bated breath in the oncologist office as she emphatically believed she had a deadly cancer and assumed the prognosis would be terminal. Imagine her immense surprise when the cancer specialist told my mother that she was actually 7 months pregnant, because that was the last thing she ever imagined happening to her. In her younger days, my father and mother had tried every conceivable fertility treatment on offer and subsequently parted with copious amounts of cash, and nothing ever worked. My parents had just given up on the possibility of having children when quite suddenly I showed up as an unexpected, random and rather belated surprise. Looking back, my mother perceived that when she finally surrendered to the reality that she would not be able to conceive, and she simply just relaxed, she believed that the letting go changed her life. From that point on, my mother would have one motto in life alone, and it was to go with the flow and let life take you down her intended pathway without holding the reins too tightly, just to see where it would take you. Growing up with older parents did have distinct advantages, as my parents quite literally were involved in every detail of my life, and they gave me their attention, time and love, and so I can assuredly say that I really had a very happy childhood. One day in my young, vibrant life was to change everything about my future in an instant that would ultimately influence my life choices quite strikingly. I remember I was invited to my very best friend Jane's birthday party, and her mother happened to be a very well-known psychic medium who gave people readings for a handsome price all over North America. Many believed that she was onto the money as far as how painstakingly accurate her predictions always were. She seemed to know who would be the next president of the United States, and when someone famous was about to fall pregnant. I was at my very best friend's birthday party, and I had dropped my mother's brooch that I had been wearing on my creamy white satin blouse, and I knew I just had to find it, because my mother would be devastated if I lost it. I was certain it had fallen under the buffet table, so when nobody was looking, I crept under the table very surreptitiously. The table was beautifully laden with delicious trays of delectable edibles, from sausage rolls to chicken drumsticks and spicy barbecue ribs. It was laden with a very long, pristine, starched white tablecloth that literally clung to the ground, so I clambered under it, scrutinizing the cream carpet for any signs of my mother's brooch, and luckily I was able to retrieve it. I was inadvertently hidden under the table when I suddenly heard my best friend's mother coming back. It appeared she was discussing me. I could hardly believe that I was actually the object of her conversation. My heart started to pump violently in my chest, and tears poured down my cheeks as I listened to her horrifying revelations about me that quite literally turned my blood as ice, as cold as ice. Any time Jane's mother had something to say, it always got my attention, because her predictions were always accurate as far as I was concerned, and I had no reason to doubt her sombre predictions for my future, or lack of future, so to speak. "Poor Geraldine," I heard her say to her friend. "The poor little mite hasn't got long to live." "How dreadfully sad," I heard another woman's voice say. "Still, that's how cruel life can be sometimes, and there's not a jot you can do about the inevitable. Still, I'm sure Jane will find a brand new friend that she likes. It's not going to be easy for poor Jane to lose her best friend. She's very attached, you know. But still, I'm sure in time she'll come to terms with it. Time can be a remarkable healer, and kids are much more resilient than adults, you know." I remember those piercing words, stung like a swarm of aggressive hornets, and the horrible predictions from Jane's mother hung over my life like an ominous black cloud, and I was never certain when that lightning bolt would strike me down. I just knew that I had to make the very best of every single moment that I had left. I realized that I was literally living on borrowed time, and so I wanted to enjoy what time I had left to the fullest. I was certain that my best friend's mother, the psychic medium, had a direct line of communication with God, and he had shared with her that I was destined to have a very short life, and that was the end of the matter. It was beyond negotiation. It was all out of my control, and there was not a thing I could do to change the road of destiny. I was certain of that fact. As a result, I made decisions for my life that did not require university degrees or any form of further education, as what was the point in wasting my energy on such fanciful pursuits when clearly I did not have much longer to live? I had no idea how I would meet my demise. Would I have a dreadful accident that would suddenly cause me to be obliterated from the world in an earth-shattering second? Or would I have a long, drawn-out, debilitating illness, like a lingering cancer? I truly hoped the former would be the case, because the idea of suffering did not tickle my boat very much. Naturally, my parents were disillusioned and disenchanted that I did not want to broaden my educational horizons, so to speak, but my mother, who always lived with a go-with-the-flow mentality, encouraged me to follow my heart, and she gave me the finances to support my wild, whimsical, naive endeavours. I was so blessed because my mother was my greatest cheerleader, and her rich, sagacious life experience had made her wise to the ways of the world. All my life I had been wild, audacious and adventurous, and at school I'd always excelled in athletics and sports and loved everything to do with the great outdoors, especially wildlife. My greatest worldly yearning was solo camping, but that was something that I never shared with my parents. I also never told them that I was desirous of exploring the remote areas of North American wilderness all on my own. So I made up a fictitious character called Ben, who would be camping with me on these exciting, compelling wilderness expeditions, and that enabled my parents to physically relax as far as concerns for my safety were concerned. They were also very disappointed that they'd never got the opportunity to meet him. "Well, at least she's in expert hands," my mother would say. "We know that this wilderness expert, Ben, will guide her wisely, so I take solace from this fact. I'm sure Geraldine will be absolutely fine. She's a spirited girl, but she's incredibly sensible." "Well, I suppose that's one less thing to worry about. But I do wish she'd gone to university. She's a very bright kid, and the world is her oyster. Why does she need to go exploring like this at such a young age? I don't understand it." "It's called going with the flow, dear," said my mother. "Let her be. One day she may decide to go to university, but what's the harm of having a year or two off? It'll do her good to gain self-awareness and give her worldly advantages over her peers, which I'm sure will happen." "Maybe you're right," sighed my father in resignation. "I'm going to trust your instincts on this one." I remember thinking that my parents were so blissfully oblivious and naively unaware of the extreme gravity and graveness of my pressing plight. I did not have long to live, and so I was going to maximize what time I had left by living to the fullest life, and each day as if it was my last. Fast forward a couple of weeks, and I was camping in a remote area of natural wilderness in the Pacific Northwest. I had bought a Dodge Challenger and would drive it close to various locations near where I intended to camp, and sometimes even to the exact location of my campground, depending on parking accessibility, of course. On this occasion I was all on my own, with just my huge backpack on my back, and my heart was fluttering with excitement. I was different to other youngsters my age, who relished socializing and dating. By contrast, I enjoyed my own company, and my suppressed spirit of adventure was bubbling to the surface, ready to experience an untamed, wild escapade. I was utterly thrilled to be out on my own, surrounded by the natural world. It really felt like an escapism from everything and everyone, and I was in my element, enjoying and appreciating every single second of what was left of this ominously short life of mine. I was not for a moment self-piteous or even angry about my plight. What was the point of wasting valuable time on worrying about something that was completely beyond my control? One day I found a beautiful open clearing in the woods, which was so picturesque you could have been forgiven for thinking that this enchanting, poetic place belonged on the cover of a Swiss chocolate box. The sensational, exquisite views over the lush green mountainous valleys were quite literally breathtaking, and I could see in my mind's eye Maria from The Sound of Music dancing down these picturesque, magical, enchanting hills, singing "The hills are alive with the sound of music." There were meadows of pretty white wild flowers, beautiful pebbly streams that meandered through the undulating valley with a very rambunctious, swift current, and there were natural formations of large rocky pools where you could swim in the crisp, clear water. It was so exquisite out here, I thought, hitching up my tent in an open clearing in the heart of the woods, surrounded by the gushing stream, natural rock pools, and exquisite waterfalls, set against the backdrop of the green hilly valleys, and it really didn't get better than this, I thought happily to myself. I prepared a fire pit by selecting some large stones for my fire, which I arranged in a round circle, and then I proceeded to boil some water to make a hot mug of sweet tea for myself. I was alone, watching the tiny squirrels darting across the meadows and racing up the trees, clearly preparing themselves in advance for the hibernation for the long months that lay ahead. They were clever creatures, I thought, always preparing for the future, never knowing what the future might have in store for them. Suddenly I noticed a male figure attired in khaki shorts and a red polo top, walking towards me hurriedly, and I remember my heart literally sank, because I thought I was out here all on my own, and I didn't want any interaction with humans. As the man came closer to my camp, I realized he was in his early 60s. His skin was weathered and heavily wrinkled, and his brown sparkling eyes appeared to be studying me curiously. Who was he, I wondered, and where on earth did he come from? I was camping out in a remote area of wilderness. How on earth had this weirdo found me, out here in the middle of nowhere, where I thought I was extremely safe? "Hello there," came the man's husky voice. "What is a young girl like you doing out on your own in the wilderness like this? It's not safe for a youngster like yourself camping out here all on your own." "I'm not on my own," I lied. "My boyfriend is out here with me, and he's a very keen hunter," I said, secretly hoping that mentioning my pretend boyfriend's hunting prowess might just intimidate the stranger. "I'm relieved to hear that," said the man, "because there have been a lot of people going missing in strange, unforeseen circumstances in this area, and I'm glad to know you're not all on your own. That boyfriend of yours is a very lucky man." I watched the man walking away, and I breathed a huge sigh of relief. "Creep," I thought to myself. "Why do you not just leave me alone? What I do out here is my business and has absolutely nothing to do with you, nosy Parker." That evening I went for a lovely swim in the natural rock pool, and luxuriated in the gloriously cool fresh water. Then I prepared a delicious freeze-dried meal of creamy chicken and pasta under the light of the starry night and full moon. It was such a sensational evening, and I felt incredibly, deliriously happy in the peace and solitude of the cessation of the day. I could hear the sounds of crickets and frogs, and the distant calls of coyotes, and I felt incredibly snug and congenial in this enchanting world. I decided to retire to my sleeping bag early that night, but I was suddenly awoken to the sounds of twigs snapping, and I was absolutely certain that someone was in my camp, snooping around. I could distinctly hear the very clear sounds of footsteps, and I was certain it was that creepy man that I'd seen earlier in the day. I peeked out of my tent, and sure enough, at 3 a.m. in the morning, I kid you not, I could see that awful man that I had observed earlier in the day wandering around my camp and studying my swimming costume that was hanging on a tree branch drying. This man was not right in the head, I thought to myself in horror. What on earth was he doing in my camp at this time of the night? His invasive, sneaking actions reeked of nefarious, unspeakable motives that left me feeling very on edge. The question is, what should I do about it? Because I was literally in the middle of nowhere, and I could hardly call anyone for help. I grabbed my rifle and clutched it tightly, wondering whether I should confront the man or just let sleeping dogs lie. I could see he was leaving my campsite as quietly as he possibly could, trying to be as soundless as possible so as to not awaken me. I was far from happy about the precarious situation I have found myself in. I knew that in the morning I'd move further up the stream, hopefully as far away from this objectionable man as I could possibly get, and so that's exactly what I did. But no sooner had I settled into my new camping site, about a 6-hour, very exhausting, strenuous hike, I might tell you, from my previous position, there he was again, like a nagging, unrelenting mosquito that you simply could not eliminate, no matter how hard you tried to squat it. "Hello there," he said, coming up to my tent, much to my extreme annoyance. "I see you've moved further upstream. That's quite some hike for a youngster like yourself. You must be very fit. That was a good 6 hours, I'd say." "Thank you," I said. "I am very fit." "Where is that boyfriend of yours?" asked the man, raising a quizzical eyebrow at me. "Oh, he's out hunting," I lied. "But he'll be back very shortly." The man grinned at me broadly. "It does seem that your spurious boyfriend really enjoys the hunt," he said with a note of sarcasm in his voice. "Every time I encounter you, he is never around. I do look forward to finally meeting him sometime." My face flushed bright red. "Do you mind?" I said. "I need to get on with preparing our camp." "You're in the middle of the sticks, love," said the man. "There's no need to rush anything when you live out here, as life has a pace all of its own." "Jokes aside," said the man, looking at me with a grave expression, "I am concerned for your safety, young lady. I assure you that you do not want to be camping out here all on your own. It's not safe for a young girl like yourself. I told you there are many young people that go missing from these parts, never to be seen or heard from ever again." "I told you," I said. "I'm not alone. My boyfriend—" "Your boyfriend," said the man, finishing my sentence. "You're not a good liar, are you?" he laughed. "There is no boyfriend, is there? The signs are everywhere. One swimming costume hanging on a branch, one pair of shoes outside your camp, and a relatively small tent that I think would be a tight squeeze for a couple, in the best of times." "All right," I said. "My boyfriend isn't here. I lied. Big deal. But I do have a Remington rifle to defend myself with, so I'm armed and extremely dangerous." The man looked at me again hesitantly, as if he wanted to say something, but suddenly refrained from doing so. "There are things out there," he said, "that you cannot shoot, because it would only antagonize the situation and make the predator even more savagely murderous." "I think my rifle can pretty much handle anything that crosses my path," I assured him. "I did my research before I came camping, and I know exactly what to expect in the event of a bear attack or a mountain lion." "Is that all you think you have to deal with out here? I wonder how many of those missing cases around here thought that their guns would also protect them from so-called predators, but sadly to no avail. Where are they now, I wonder?" "You've lost me," I said. "What on earth are you talking about? How do you know so much about all these missing cases anyway?" "Because I was in the force," said the man, "and I've been investigating these missing cases for many long years, and there is something about those woods and something in those woods that has been killing people out there. I've seen it myself, and it's a gargantuan monster. You need to be very careful, because that thing is around. Don't worry about me, I assured him. I've not got long to live anyway, so I doubt I need to concern myself with monsters. Oh, my word, said the man. I had no idea. You don't look at all sick. I suppose I get it now. Why a young, pretty girl like you is out here solo camping. It kind of makes sense to me now. How long have you got left, if you don't mind me asking? Good question, I said. I have absolutely no idea. Well, maybe that's for the best, he said in a gentle tone of voice. Even so, you do need to be careful out here. There are things in those woods that are very dangerous, volatile, and unpredictable. Things that cannot be trusted. Oh, by the way, I'm Ted for the record, he said. I'm Geraldine, I said. Nice name, he said. It suits you. I actually like it. Once the man had actually left, I decided that maybe he wasn't a creep after all. Perhaps I'd been a little hard on him. It did appear that he'd been in the police force, and it would seem that the missing cases that he had investigated had left him flawed and flummoxed. Could there be any truth about a monster in the woods, I wondered? Had he really seen a gargantuan beast in there? Somehow I really doubted it. In my experience, most monsters responsible for murder cases were of the human kind, and as far as I knew, the most treacherous predator in North America was a grizzly bear or a mountain lion. I'm sure he's barking up the wrong tree, I thought to myself. I realised that maybe this prying ex-officer was just keeping a friendly eye on me, which in a strange way was somewhat reassuring and rather endearing, in a funny sort of way, I suppose. That night I was awoken to a very foul smell that literally stank like a decomposing corpse, and smelly trainers rolled all into one, and the smell infused the air with an acrid intensity. It was unlike anything I've ever smelt before, and it was horrifying and so repugnant it was literally causing my nose to burn and my eyes to flood with tears. What the heck is that? I wondered in horror. Suddenly I heard the rustling of leaves and the crunching of twigs beneath heavy, colossal-sized feet. Believe me when I say that these feet belonged to something hefty, and I was in no doubt about that. And whatever this thing was, it was thundering around my campsite like a rhino in a horse box. It was making a hell of a ruckus. It was utterly terrifying. I quickly grabbed my rifle, suddenly feeling pathetically small and inconsequential. My rifle felt so silly, like a kid's toy in my hands. Whatever was outside my tent was quite literally as large as an elephant. Of that I was certain. My heightened senses were literally in overdrive, and yet I was so paralysed by terror that I was seemingly unable to make any decisions. It was like even my rational senses had all but abandoned and deserted me in the very moment in time when every decision I made was of pivotal significance. What should I do? That was the question that floored me. Did I need to run or keep a low profile and remain in my tent and hope with all my heart that this horrible critter would finally leave? I could hear the creature literally yards away from my tent, and the smell emanating from this thing was so offensively ripe. I put on my headlamp and unzipped a small section of my tent. I kid you not, I could see within touching distance of my tent a gargantuan hairy body that was so incredibly tall that all I got to see was the chunky legs and thick waist area that was covered in long flowing dark brown matted hair that literally stunk to high heaven and resembled very ugly dreadlocks. The bottom half of this peculiar creature looked like an old teddy bear that was blown up into the size of a monster, because whatever this thing was, it was elephantine in its size and proportions. As it breathed, it sounded exactly like a horse, and then it began to growl. And finally it started to hammer my tent with its humongous fists that were so powerful they literally caused the entire tent to vibrate under the sheer powerful force. Whatever this ghastly thing was, it wanted to kill me. I was in no doubt about that. What was I going to do? Fear gripped my body like a frozen block of ice that engulfed my entire being with feeling of absolute impending dread. So it was that with clumsy hands I tried to cut open the back of my tent, but in the process I cut myself because my clammy fingers were fumbling so much with anxiety and haste that I could not even cut the tent open in a straight line. I was so disorientated. Finally the back of the tent did open, and I scrambled through it hurriedly, running away as fast as I could towards the wooded area, where I took cover behind an oak tree. I wanted to get a quick look at what this thing was that had been trying to attack me. I was clutching my Remington rifle for dear life so very tightly, and I was trying to precariously aim it at whatever this creature actually was. Suddenly I heard powerful gunshots from a rifle infinitely superior to mine, clearly designed to take down very heavy prey. In the light of the pearly crescent moon and the silvery stars, as well as my bright headlamp, and the headlamp worn by Ted, I saw that he was the one that was trying to kill this beast. I had never in all my born days seen a creature like this. Truly it was King Kong-like in girth, stature, weight and height. If I'm being conservative, I would estimate that this thing was 10 foot tall, 1,000 pounds, and 5 foot wide. It was so incredibly colossal, and every area of its body just rippled with dense muscle, and the shoulders on this creature were humongous. I noticed the head was shaped like a cone, and the face was remarkably human-like, although there were very definite ape-like influences to the creature's appearance, from the overlong arms to the very distinctive brow ridge. Everything that night was happening way too fast for me to stomach. Every second felt like an entire lifetime on the scale of time. I could see that this critter had only one intention, and it wanted blood, and lots of it. When it saw the ex-police officer, or should I say Ted, aiming at it, I could tell that it was livid and incandescent with rage. The only way I can describe this critter's behaviour was like that of a very angry rabid dog, or an elephant in musk. Its behaviour was irrational, driven and powered by an intention to kill, almost like testosterone-driven. And nothing else mattered, and common sense did not prevail, nor any sense of self-preservation. It was prepared to fight to the death, and if the assault of bullets was anything to go by, the critter became even more irate. I could tell that a couple of bullets had actually hit him in the shoulders, but had appeared not to incapacitate him in the slightest, but fueled him with an even greater desire to fight back with deadly intent. Before I knew it, the creature grabbed the gun and threw it into the trees, and then he took hold of poor Ted and whirled him in the air like a pizza several times, catching him like a rag doll. And then he finally snapped Ted's neck and decapitated him like a chicken. I could barely believe what I was actually seeing with my eyes. I just knew that if I shot at the creature, that I would end up exactly like Ted in his predicament. I had no idea what to do, so I decided I would shimmy up a tree and hide up there in the branches. I was athletic, agile and slight, and I had mastered the art of tree climbing from a very young age, and so I shimmied up the tree and lay hidden in the branches for the rest of the night, waiting for the full light of the morning to arrive. I couldn't see anything, but I'd heard enough. I could hear grunting, sniffing and stampeding over my campsite, and then I heard the creature thundering through the forest, and he sounded exactly like a herd of rhinos. It was horrifying. In the morning I awoke to find my campsite in a total mess, and I could see my tent had been shredded up and was scattered everywhere like pieces of confetti. I could see that all my items had been flung absolutely everywhere, and it looked like hell and damnation had broken loose. Some of my garments were lying over bushes, and pots were scattered surreptitiously all over the ground. Suddenly I heard the sound of a woman sobbing. She was cradling Ted's detached head all in her arms like a ball, and I noticed that his eyes were missing from his corpse, as if they'd been purposely removed. "Who does this?" she sobbed. "What kind of a monster? It's even removed his eyes." To cut a long story short, this kindly woman was indeed Ted's wife, and she told me that all his life in the force, Ted had been very bothered by missing people in the area and was hell-bent on resolving these curious cases. When he actually caught me camping out in the woods, he was very concerned for my safety because he had seen that humanoid ape in the woods before, and he believed that this creature was violent and aggressive and incredibly dangerous and could potentially be behind some of these missing cases. When he saw me solo camping, he believed I was in grievous danger, so he was patrolling the place at night, unbeknown to me, while I was camping to ensure my safety. As you can imagine, I felt responsible for Ted's death, but his wife reassured me that Ted would have not had it any other way. I suggested that we went to the police together to file a report, but Ted's wife told me to go home and to get lots of rest. She reassured me that she would be the one filing the report, but she was never going to mention anything about that humanoid ape, because no one would ever believe us. So she was going to register Ted's death as a bear attack. I immediately returned home to the delight of my parents, who didn't ask me any awkward questions, because they were too delighted to have me back. I decided to visit my best friend Jane's mother and ask her exactly how long I did have to live, because if I only had weeks left, I needed to know about it, and I needed to know about it now. "Mrs. Robinson," I said, "I'm not going to beat around the bush. I'm going to say it as it is, and I want an honest answer from you. Please tell me, how long have I got to live? It's very important that I know the facts. You must tell me." Jane's mother looked at me in amazement. "I'm a psychic, dear. I'm not God. How could I possibly know how long you've got to live? That's not up to me." "But," I stammered, "I heard you at Jane's birthday party discussing that I didn't have long to live. I know I heard you. You clearly told your friend. You said poor Geraldine hasn't got long and it's going to be very hard for Jane to lose her best friend." "Geraldine, dear, was not you. Geraldine was Jane's gerbil. Don't you remember she named it after you? She considered Geraldine one of her best furry friends. He only got to live a month after that party, bless him." "So I'm not dying?" I asked in amazement. "As far as I know, dear, no, you're not." So there you are. That's my story. I did end up going to university and getting a degree, but I'm now a grief counsellor, actually helping people with dealing with tragic and disastrous events, because I'm quite good at that by now. I'm also happily married with 2 children, but believing I was living on borrowed time for so long enabled me to grab life with both hands and enjoy every moment, and I still live by that today. All these years later, in about the late 2000s, I discovered that that animal that killed Ted was in fact a Bigfoot. Whether this creature was responsible for other missing cases, I am not entirely sure, but this creature was incredibly dangerous. But as with all these creatures, some of these Bigfoots are good and others are bad. And that creature that I encountered, well, he was most certainly the latter. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Andrea, and I guess you could call me a typical hillbilly, as I've lived in Appalachia virtually all my life, and growing up I was one among 3 children, the only girl in our family home. My mother got married when she was 17 years old, and the marriage sadly only lasted a few months after my father finally just abandoned us, and my parents subsequently divorced. He worked for about $1 a day in a sawmill. I never felt angry towards my father for abandoning us, because he was only about 21 when he did actually abscond. And I think he left us because raising a family at the time, at such a young age, with so little money, was not fun for a young man in his prime of life, who had not only even begun to live yet. I gather he left Appalachia and went to live in Kansas. Personally, I doubt I would have ever coped with raising a family at such a young age myself, so I'm hardly in a position to cast stones at him. Even so, I would love to know what became of him, and whether he did end up having some children, because I might have some half-siblings floating around somewhere. As you can imagine, life was exceedingly hard for a young girl like my mother, raising 4 rambunctious children like ourselves, and believe me, we were a handful, always getting ourselves into all kinds of trouble, and we just loved pranking just about everyone. We would do the most horrendous things, like stuffing our grandmother's handbag with frogs, so when it came to giving collection at church on a Sunday morning and she began to open her purse, all these frogs would go hopping around the church, and some people would scream frantically with shock because there were literally hundreds of these frogs darting around everywhere. Another time we would put a couple of snails on our pastor's domed hat that he would wear during a church service, and we would be laughing hysterically when the pastor got up to do the sermon, with snails wiggling around on his hat, and everyone in the congregation was laughing so very much, and the humorless pastor was so happy because he'd never ever seen the congregation so animated by one of his services before. We managed to retrieve the snails without him ever knowing, and for years after the event he would always ask his wife what it was that he had said during the service to arouse such humour among the congregation. I don't believe she ever had the heart to actually tell him. We had a very simple basic life growing up, and lived in a very small square bricked house that my father had built, and really consisted mainly of a kitchen and 4 bedrooms and a living room. We lived without all the modern amenities people have today, although there are parts of Appalachia still today that live in the Dark Ages without any power. We had no juice, which in Appalachia literally means no power and electricity, and in those days we would get around with a horse and buggy, or otherwise we would walk everywhere by foot, so there was no need for a gym in those days because we were naturally fit. We would help my mother by growing vegetables during the summer months with the assistance of a horse and plough. We would then can all our food for the winter months. We would also go coon, squirrel and rabbit hunting, and we would eat the meat as food, and believe me, the meat was always tender and delicious, and my mother was a marvellous cook, so she knew how to turn the toughest cuts of meat into culinary masterpieces. My mother eventually got remarried to a very gentle giant called Bert. He was a very likeable, easy kind of guy whom we all warmed to immediately because he had a very good sense of humour and a kind heart, but unfortunately he got caught up in the moonshine business, so there were times when he was never ever sober. One of the locals actually taught him how to make maize and sugar and distill his own alcohol, and from that moment on there was no looking back for him. Luckily he was not an obnoxious drunk, but he was not good at dealing with alcohol in any way, and he would end up stumbling around the place completely off his head. The trouble with that moonshine is that it is clear like water, and a few sips of that stuff is pretty lethal and far worse than vodka. Growing up, I would say the natural world was pretty much our playground, and my brother and I had a very good life, and we always found ways to entertain ourselves, and the views around our home were exquisitely beautiful, and we were surrounded by mountainous valleys, beautiful open pastures, silvery lakes, ponds, gravel pits, rocky outcrops, and ubiquitous areas of forest that literally stretch back for hundreds of miles. Our area consisted of all the usual animals that you get in Appalachia, and we had regular visits from black bears that would sometimes even poke their heads through the front door as if to say hello at us, but luckily a lone gunshot usually got them to run away pretty fast. One day my brother and I decided to go exploring in a mountainous valley that was really a very big challenge to climb, but growing up with brothers, I was naturally desirous of always being included in their fun and games, even if it did mean pushing myself that much harder physically in order to be included as one of the boys. We began to climb and climb and climb and climb what appeared to be a very steep, treacherous, mountainous elevation. It felt like we'd been hiking forever, and the sweat was pouring down my forehead, and my clothes were drenched with sweat, and I was breathing heavily. Luckily, we'd brought water bottles with us, so we sat down on the mountainous outcrop and we enjoyed the view of the Appalachia from the high elevation while we hydrated ourselves. It was really idyllic, and our little home looked like a quaint tiny dot in the distance. It was a prime position to observe everything from hundreds of miles away. Suddenly I smelt the most disgusting smell that I've ever smelt in my whole life, and it wafted over to where we were sitting. It smelt like a rotting skunk and dead, decomposing flesh, and it was utterly revolting. We looked around for the source of the smell and could not find anything. As we continued to climb, I suddenly lost my footing and went tumbling into this little hollow, and fell onto the edge of a small opening that we discovered by chance led into a large cave. This was where the smell was emanating from. My brothers were incredibly excited to discover a huge cave in this mountainous outcrop, and so we proceeded to look around the cave for the source of the smell, expecting to find a dead body lying somewhere in the cave. We came across what appeared to be several large nests on the dirt floor, made up of mosses, grasses and leaves, and the area was so trampled down as if very big creatures like large bears had been lying on those beds. But these weren't the nests of large bears, I can assure you. There was also a pile of walnuts on the floor of the cave. It was curiously bizarre and exceedingly peculiar, to say the least. "Something is living in here," said my brother Robert, obviously stating the obvious. "You mean some things," corrected my brother Ethan. "It looks like 4 creatures are nesting in here, and whatever they are very big, judging by the size of the flattened grass on these nesting areas." We had lived in Appalachia all our lives, and couldn't make any sense of these nests at all that we had discovered, as they did not fit the profile of a bear or any other animal that we knew of. When I smelt the grassy beds, I realized that the ghastly smell emanated from the bedding, so it would appear that who or what was lying in the bed was the real source of the stench. "We need to come back here," said Robert, "another time when we're armed. I'm eager to find out what these creatures actually are," he said, with a broad beam developing on his face. Robert was exceedingly excited and intrigued, and was the most adventurous in our family, and simply loved resolving mysteries and puzzles. Ethan and Eric, on the other hand, were not as enthusiastic about this crazy idea, because they were much less spontaneous, and were so grounded that they didn't like to seek out things that could potentially be dangerous. "No, I think we need to leave these creatures well alone, because whatever they are, they're not small. They smell rank, and they could potentially be aggressive and very dangerous." That evening, after a long, tiring day of exploring, we all retired to bed very early, only to be awoken by these loud, thunderous bangs all around our home. Bear in mind, at the best of time, our house was not big, but we could tell that something really hefty was walking across our roof, and appeared to be banging the timber beams. The commotion was so incredibly loud that all 3 of us kids and my mother snuggled together in the middle of the house, clutching each other in fear, while Ethan hung on to his Remington rifle with hands that were so tight I could see his knuckles had turned bright pink. Amidst this chaotic commotion and upheaval in our home, my stepfather was zonked out by too much moonshine and was snoring loudly on the couch, seemingly oblivious to the barrage of activity taking place outside our home. "What on earth is going on?" cried my mother. "Something is on our roof trying to terrorize us." She tried to wake up our stepfather, but he was like someone who was under a major anesthetic, because nothing seemed to rouse him. That moonshine had truly knocked him out. The banging on our roof was utterly relentless, but things got even worse, as we could hear the loudest roars that were so utterly terrifying that even the china on my mother's dresser started to shake and vibrate, and the picture on the wall came crashing off, landing yards away from my stepfather, violently shattering, and glass went flying everywhere. Suddenly my stepfather woke up with a start, and in a drunken stupor he grabbed his rifle and stumbled to the door, yanking it open. "Those bloody bears," he said, rambling out of the house, wobbling precariously on his skinny legs due to the effects of the moonshine, which appeared to make him incredibly unstable on his feet. "Bert," my mother cried out, "get back in. There's something big and dangerous out there." It was too late. Bert hadn't listened, and my mother quickly slammed the door behind him because she was afraid those creatures would come running in. She immediately put the lamp outside on the ground to help Bert see what he was doing, as we had no outside lights in those days. She was so terrified that whatever was out there on the roof would come bolting back into the house. "The stupid, stupid man," I could hear my mother mumbling to herself. "I told him that Moonshine would kill him. I told him, but he would never listen." Ethan was looking outside the window, and I could hear him saying, "What the heck is that?" So I scurried over to the window to observe what it was that Ethan was in fact looking at. Bert was there fumbling around with his rifle. He appeared confused, muddled, and very disorientated. He didn't seem to know one end from his rifle from the other, which was very odd. He was trying to defend himself from this monstrous black giant that literally bounced off our roof with the agility of a pussycat and came thundering towards Bert at record speed. Bert literally unloaded his rifle, but not into the creature as he had intended, but into his own chest. He fell back instantly and just lay there lifeless in a bloody heap on the ground. He had accidentally just killed himself in trying to defend himself against this curious animal that was about to attack him. The animal lifted Bert's deceased body into the air and threw it around several times in his large jumbo-sized hands, as if Bert was some kind of a soft toy. The creature was so colossal that he made Bert appear like a tiny rag doll. That's how pathetically small Bert actually appeared. I remember standing at the window. It was a full moon, and the light of our oil lamp outside made me see even more clearly. I was frozen and incapacitated by a fear that I have never known, so much so that I was literally incapable of moving a muscle. My heart was pounding in my chest so fast and so loud that I literally heard every single beat. I am certain that my eyes were as large as saucers and that my mouth was hanging open like a fly trap. I was unable to believe what I was actually witnessing with my eyes. I was almost certain I was going to awake from a horrifying nightmare, only to find that it was just some dreadful dream. This could not really have happened, could it? The creature was like a human giant. I know of no other way to describe him. I mean, Bert was 6 foot tall, but this creature towered over him by another 4 feet, so he could not have been less than 10 feet. He was 5 foot wide and easily over 1,000 pounds. He was so human-like in stature, only infinitely much larger, and he was covered from head to toe with 2-inch thick black hair. The creature had a bullet-shaped head that blended seamlessly into a large pair of beefy shoulders, larger than anything I've ever seen. The creature was just a mass of muscle definition, tone and solid brawn, and he was hefty, chunky, burly, and super strong. Everything about his body exuded power, strength, and dominance. Even though I could not tell he was a male because of the thick covering of hair, I assure you everything about this creature exuded testosterone on a very large scale. He was driven by anger, rage, and fury. I could tell that this critter, whatever it was, had very definite ape-like characteristics in its physical appearance that were notable in the overlong arms and very distinct brow ridge, flat nose, and grey leathery hairy face. Ethan and I watched in horror as this creature obliterated Bert's body, and I mean obliterated, by aggressively thumping it against our front door several times, like he was slamming a pole. And then he continued to climb on the roof, beating the panels violently until the dark night retreated and the early morning made its presence finally known. By that time the creature had vanished, and the whole house smelt of death and decay. When we opened the front door, we could not believe what we were seeing. We found Bert's body, bone, sinew, fat, and blood splattered against our front door, with pools of blood lying close to where he had accidentally shot himself. You would have thought that we would be howling and crying in dismay, but my whole family was so subdued and so quiet, and no one said a word. All was very, very still. We allowed the practicalities of daily life and cleaning up the gruesome mess and organising Bert's funeral to take precedence over our emotional state, which was a good thing. I think all the practicalities of running the home enabled us to suppress our emotional anguish, distress and grief over what recently had transpired. The great thing about living in Appalachia is that you are never short of friendly neighbours to help you out in crisis situations by making you meals, helping you clean up your place and being there for you when you need them for a chat. Everyone was absolutely horrified about what had happened to Bert and how he'd accidentally killed himself, but the mysterious creature that had obliterated Bert's body after it was actually dead left my mother's friends very confused and alarmed about what this curious creature could have been that had hounded our family during the night. No one had any idea of what it was. One of my neighbours called a Native American elder to come and see us because she believed he knew many of the mysteries about Appalachia from his forefathers before him. Maybe he would make sense of this curious creature that we had encountered. The Native American was called White Feather, and when he arrived at our home his face was very solemn and serious, and we began to tell him all the details of our terrifying, grievous night, and how we had observed a giant ape-like humanoid that had attacked Bert after he'd killed himself by obliterating his body until he was just a mangled, runny mess of body fluids, bone and fat. "What have you done?" asked White Feather. "You must have done something to provoke the kahuna. What did you do?" "Nothing," we said. "We did nothing." "You did something to upset the kahuna," insisted White Feather. "Try and think." Ethan was green at the gills. "We did go hiking over the mountainous ridge over there, and we did find a cave with all these nests in there, but we never disturbed a thing, I promise." "This is very grave," said White Feather. "What you have done is highly offensive to the kahuna. You were intruding upon their private space. They are very territorial. They must have sensed and smelt your energy, so they came back to seek revenge, which was why you lost your stepfather so tragically." "Well, it was a mistake," I insisted. "Bert accidentally shot himself. I saw him do it. He was so drunk on that moonshine." "Is that what you think?" chuckled the native elder. "The kahuna know how to play mind games. They got Bert to kill himself. It was no accident. It looked that way, I'm sure." "Are they coming back to kill the rest of us?" I asked in horror. "It was all my fault we stumbled on the cave in the first place, and I didn't mean anything by snooping around. We were just curious and very interested, that's all." "We need to make some kind of restitution so that you're not all in danger. You need to make a formal apology to the kahuna." "How are we going to do that?" I asked. "Those creatures will kill us before we even approach them, I'm sure of it." "It amazes me how little you white people know about energy. Everything in this universe is energy, and we're going to use energy and vibration to apologize to the kahuna." And so it was when the golden tangerine sun set over the valley and the darkness rolled in over the horizon that White Feather gave a piece of timber to each one of us and instructed us all to use our minds to express our apologies to the kahuna by planting all our thoughts in the timber, which is exactly what we had to do. In other words, we needed to talk to our own piece of timber and express our sincere apologies. Once the timber was burnt, the smoke from the fire would be like a conveyor of our messages in the timber that the kahuna would be able to comprehend and read. I wanted to believe White Feather, but it seemed so crazy to me that a piece of timber that I spoke to with my mind once burnt would convey a message to the kahuna. However, I was willing to do anything to prevent that terrifying beast from ever coming back. I spoke to my timber in my mind and I said, "I'm so sorry. I really didn't mean to intrude upon your space and your territory. I was very curious and nosy, and I know I shouldn't have been. I meant you no harm, and I'm really, really sorry. Please don't hurt my family, especially since it's my fault." Once the fire was burning, my brothers, mother and I placed our logs on the fire, while White Feather began to chant, and to sing in a strange, curious tongue. We could see the smoke from our fire pit rising as our timber logs were burnt, and then we heard whooping sounds across the valley, in response to White Feather's strange chanting and the curious smoke that was created from the fire, which I have to tell you was different to the usual smoke we would see, and that was curious indeed. I think we may have appeased the kahuna, he said, but you will only know in the morning when they leave you a sign at your front door. If you receive that sign, they have chosen to forgive you. That night we were not disturbed by any commotion on our roof, which we were thankful for, but the following morning we were very apprehensive when we opened the front door, but we luckily found 4 feathers on our doorstep, so we knew at once that we had been forgiven by the kahuna. After that crazy event in my life returned to normal for us, but all these years later I realized that the kahuna are in fact the hairy humanoid that you call Bigfoot. I do know those creatures have the ability to read energy, to manipulate minds, and they have powers that we cannot even conceive of. They seem to tap into things beyond human understanding and comprehension, which may be why they manage to keep out of the shadows, so few of us actually get to see them. That is my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Niles, and I have an absolutely extraordinary Bigfoot encounter to share with you that I consider to be one of a kind. My Bigfoot encounter happened in 1987 in the Ozarks when I was 30 years old at the time. Growing up, I'd always been considered the type of person that would never ever get married. My friends just believed I was not the settling down type. I'd independently travelled extensively, especially all over North America. I loved camping, fishing, mountain climbing and canoeing. I taught wilderness survival skills once a week and also assisted the Boy Scouts from time to time, teaching them techniques such as tying knots and making campfires. I was in my element because I loved everything to do with the great outdoors, and life was an enormous adventure for me. Of course, at the time I was interested in girls, but dating was not something that actually appealed to me, and I was a disaster at chatting up girls. My biggest problem was that I was painfully shy, self-effacing, and exceedingly reserved. I was not a bad-looking fellow, and some women described me as a great catch, because I was rugged and handsome, 6 foot tall, an athletic build, dark hair and blue eyes. However, good looks are not enough to land you a good girl. It also requires the skill of a seductive, charming tongue, something I clearly lacked in my repertoire. I had been on multiple dates, all with disastrous, unfavourable outcomes. One woman went so far as to escape from me during our dinner by excusing herself by going to the bathroom and climbing through the back toilet window at the restaurant and making a hasty escape. We had sat there in cumbersome, somewhat awkward silence for a very long time, and I didn't know what the heck to say. And I know I appeared standoffish because I was so reticent and repressed. I remember I was completely tongue-tied at the time. I must have come across as a complete fumbling idiot, so I cannot say I blame her for running off like that. I gather she told her girlfriends that she would have had more fun with a piranha than with someone as timid and skittish as I was, because to her the gawky silence over dinner was utterly deafening. On another date, in agonizing, nervous attempt to make polite, meaningful conversation, I commented on how much the woman was actually enjoying her food, and I meant it as a big compliment. I proceeded to boldly say that I could tell she loved her food because she looked remarkably healthy. The woman then threw a glass of wine in my face and told me she did not need a jerk like me in her life, and how dare I call her fat. I was not even suggesting she was fat, but there I was, putting my foot in it all over again. Then on another date set up for me by a friend of mine, it also inauspiciously ended in disaster. The woman was so fussy and punctilious about her order and kept sending all her dishes back to the kitchen, complaining bitterly all the time. I told you I want the dressing separate from the salad. Not on the salad. Are you stupid or what? She said to the waitress, explaining to me that she couldn't abide airheads. The waitress brought her the salad again with the dressing on the side that she had insisted upon, along with a glass of lemonade that she had also ordered. Once again my date exploded, saying, "I told you I did not want a lemon piece in my lemonade. Why did you not listen? Are you deaf or something?" I remember the poor waitress looked so belittled and humiliated as my dates caused such a commotion about absolutely everything that even the customers at other tables were looking at each other and whispering among themselves, drawing uncomfortable attention to our table, which I could have well done without because I'm not the most attention-seeking exhibitionist at the best of times. When the waitress brought our main course, my date started to shriek at the waitress like a headmistress lecturing a pupil for very bad behaviour. "I told you that I do not want any butter on my chicken breast." "That's not butter," the waitress insisted. "It's just lemon juice with a touch of parsley in it, I promise you." "Do I look stupid?" went on my date in a raised voice. The waitress shook her head. "Good," she said. "Now take my chicken back and make it the way I ordered it." I watched the waitress scuttle away with a terrified look on her face, and her eyes were brimming with tears. "Do you not think you were a little hard on the poor girl?" I asked, leaping to the waitress's defence. "I mean, she's trying her very best to give us good service, and I think she's doing a great job. She's trying very hard to please us." My date gasped at me in horror. "You are taking sides with the waitress," she said. "That's appalling. I'm your date, and you're treating that airhead better than me. You disgust me. You clearly do not know how to treat a lady right," she said. I watched her rising from her seat, grabbing her handbag and thrusting it under her arm. "Right, I'm out of here," she said, storming out of the restaurant in a huff, making a huge spectacle of herself as she swaggered off, delighting in the attention she was arousing among all the customers. "Tell that friend of yours to stop setting me up on such crap dates," she hissed, and she finally left the premises. I still remember an elderly couple looking at me so piteously on the opposite table, and the purple-rinsed elderly woman whispered to me, "You're better off without him, love." I settled the bill and raced out of the restaurant as fast as I possibly could. I don't think I've ever been so humiliated in my entire life. In that moment I decided that I would never, ever date again. One day at a local diner with a friend of mine called Mike, I met a very attractive brunette, a waitress called Celeste, and we went on a couple of dates together. She was a garrulous yet charming woman who loved talking about herself, which helped me significantly with my painful, reticent shyness, and to make matters even better, she never asked me about myself at all. At that time I did consider her lack of interest in me not a bad thing at all, because I absolutely hated talking about myself. I was young and naive at the time, so when she announced that we were going to get married a few months later, I guess I just went along with it. No one was more surprised than my betting friends, who had never believed it was remotely possible that I would ever tie the knot, given my painful, awkward shyness with women, and my huge passion for solo adventures in the American wilderness, hardly an aspiring resume for a potential husband. Celeste and I settled down in a small apartment in Seattle that she turned into a cosy, glamorous den with designer furnishings and stylish wallpapers and fabrics. Celeste loved spending many nights out with her girlfriends, and never minded me sauntering off on my wilderness excursions because she relished her own space. The reality was that at times in our lives we were sometimes like water and oil, and we didn't always mix together all that well. Well, not at that time anyway. I was a manager at the time for a wilderness camping shop, selling all kinds of curious camping gear to outdoorsy, adventurous types of people, while Celeste was an interior designer helping people to recreate a glamorous home, and some of her clients were affluent, high society types that earned a great deal of money. I was passionate about my job because the store I worked for sold everything from rifles for hunting, outdoor clothes, hiking shoes, fishing rods, tackle, and all the accessories you could possibly need for camping. I would meet people like myself who were so passionate and excited about the great outdoors, and so my job always involved listening to the stories from people's camping adventures, and believe me, there were many, from strange ghostly encounters to weird sightings of unusual creatures and odd things that happened to them while they were camping. When I would return home at night to Celeste, she would happily talk about herself, prepare a delicious meal for the both of us, telephone her friends, and talk on the telephone for absolute ages about seemingly nothing of any real relevance at all. Then she would retire to bed or watch a little television with me. We really didn't communicate much in those days, nor did we share any interest in common, as Celeste was a social butterfly at the time, and I was introverted and outdoorsy. It was like we were two ships at the time passing in the night that didn't have much interaction together, but I always hoped that one day that would change. On one occasion, Celeste did present me with a hefty life insurance policy to sign. I think given the fact that you're always going off on wilderness excursions, I think it's wise to take out this policy, she advised me. If something dreadful, accidental or fortuitous were to happen to you, God forbid, and you were attacked by a bear or plunged to your death in attempting to climb a high ravine, I don't want to be left penniless, picking up the pieces of my life, especially if I'm a mother with children at the time. That would be awful. What she said was pragmatic and made perfect sense to me, so I signed the life insurance policy willingly, as protecting my wife was a circumspect decision for any man in my position to make. As an outdoorsy type, I had experienced many near-fatal misses in my life that could ultimately have resulted in premature death. I hardly wanted poor Celeste to be an early widow, given that many of my ventures did involve high-scale, sometimes perilous risks. On one occasion I was nearly killed by a black bear, but I successfully played dead, and he lost interest in me. Another time I was stranded in an icy cold Arctic conditions after a nasty fall, and ended up nearly dying of hypothermia, and spent several weeks recuperating in hospital. One day I told my wife Celeste that I was going on a solo camping trip to the Ozarks, and as usual she was fine about my going. On the contrary, she seemed delighted to have me out of her hair for a whole week. I noticed that she seemed unusually interested about whereabouts I would be camping in the Ozarks, so I pointed to her an area on my map where I intended to go exploring. I was actually so pleased that she was showing some interest in my adventure and asking me so many curious questions about my trip and what I intended to do, as that was so out of character for her to appear so enthralled in my outdoor activities. Maybe she was becoming more inquisitive in my pursuits of my outdoor life, I thought happily to myself. Fast forward a couple of days and I was in my utter element. I was in the Ozarks, also known as the Ozark Mountain or Ozark Plateau, in the psychographic region of Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and the southeast corner of Kansas. The rocks that initially formed the Ozarks are made from sand and silt, with remains of marine animals that were laid down in a shallow sea about 542 million years ago. You can see some of the plant and marine-like fossils embedded within the rocks there when you go swimming in the rock pools, and it is extremely fascinating. Personally, I adore the Ozarks, and this was not my first solo camping trip out there. I loved the rugged rocky terrain, the exquisite foaming white plunging waterfalls, the caverns and pools of exquisite cool water, surrounded by magnificent rocky formations, often embedded with fossils like seashells and plant material. I also loved the rich terrain of the forest that consisted of primary white oaks, hickory and short-leaved pine, along with the river beds where you could find river birch, maple, sycamore, redbud and dogwood. The area was also teeming with wild animals from muskrats, deer, bobcats, otters, bats, and the occasional odd black bear. You also have to watch out for venomous snakes, like the cottonhead, coppermouth, and rattlesnakes, and invariably if you're swimming in one of those glorious rock pools, you'll often spot water snakes skirting across the water, which, believe me, is not an uncommon sight, and is very likely to be seen. It was on the third night camping, and it was very hot, humid and muggy, which is pretty standard for the Ozarks in the middle of summer, even though tropical rain was common in these parts during the summer, so it could become cloudy and overcast very suddenly. I'm glad to say that luckily I'd not experienced a downfall yet. I was enjoying sleeping in an open hammock under the silvery stars at night. I set up in my sleeping quarters in a very inconspicuous, discreet private area between two white oak trees that were well hidden and extremely well camouflaged. The site was absolutely perfect because it overlooked a large rocky clearing over exquisite waterfalls and the most glorious rock pool that was the most incredible place to cool off in on a hot, scorching summer's day. What could be better? I hadn't prepared a tent for myself because I was really roughing it caveman style. I hid my huge rucksack under piles of leaves so that it remained invisible. I did not want my presence to be clear to the natural wildlife in the area because when they sense humans are around, they keep a very safe distance. I loved wildlife and was desirous to be one with nature, so blending in with my environment was significant to me. It would seem that despite my near-death experience with a bear once, it had done little to curtail my huge appreciation for animals, and I could quite literally watch animals for hours through my binoculars, and if they sensed my presence, they would not hang around for very long, because invariably they are skittish around humans, and rightfully so. It was about 12 o'clock at night when I awoke, feeling incredibly hot, sticky, sweaty and clammy, so I decided to take a dip in the cool water at the rock pool. And as I plunged into the water, I felt so refreshed and invigorated. And then I heard it. It was the sound of two pairs of bipedal feet rushing through the undergrowth, walking towards the rock pool where I was actually swimming. I immediately hid in the water under the rocky ledge, taking care not to be observed. It was then that I saw two men, who appeared to be wearing military-style camouflage clothing known as fatigues, carrying powerful rifles in their hands. It was the conversations that they were having together that made my blood run cold. They were standing so close to where I was hiding that I could have literally reached out to touch their ankles if I'd wanted to. "Where the heck is he? How the hell are we going to take him down if we can't even locate him?" one of the men was saying. "I was informed that he's located in this area and should not be difficult to spot," came another man's voice. "Well, we need to get the job done as soon as possible on Maxwell's strict orders, ASAP. Do you understand?" As I was listening to this conversation, I suddenly remembered the life insurance policy that Celeste had urged me to take out, and now I was listening to two men discussing how they were going to murder me. I was utterly horrified. Could this really be happening to me? My heart was racing and my hair stood up on the back of my neck. I felt so violently sick, I just wanted to throw up. I had heard of women who had killed their husbands for life insurance policies before, but I would never have considered Celeste to be that vindictive, malign or evil type of woman who was out for insatiably everything she could get her indulgent hands on. Clearly I did not know her at all. I watched the men scouting the area and was so relieved that all my camping gear was so well concealed that you would have been forgiven for believing that the whole area was devoid of human habitation. I'd always camped this way before, and now this way of camping was quite literally saving my life. I've always had really great tracking skills, and so I wanted to find out as much as possible as I could about these men. Who on earth was Celeste hiring to kill me? It was absolutely extraordinary that she was going to such extreme lengths to do away with me. I knew I wasn't the greatest husband, but was a huge life insurance policy payout more pleasurable for her than my presence in her life? Such horrendous revelations was a huge slap in the face for me, as I began to realize what a sham my marriage actually appeared to have become. Just when I thought things were looking more promising in our relationship of late. The following day I was very cautious about all my activities, making sure that I did not do anything that could attract attention to myself, and I then heard the men all over again. This time I was in my hammock, well concealed from the clearing. Once again the men were walking towards the same rock pool where I had been swimming the previous night. "Where the hell is he?" I heard one of the men say. "How can something leave no trail whatsoever? How is that even possible?" "Well, maybe he knows we're trying to hunt him down." "I'm the best tracker in the business. I cannot go back to the base and admit that I've failed on this expedition. Failure's not an option for me. That's not going to look good on my meticulous military record. Maxwell has put his full trust in my professional expertise because he knows I can be relied upon to take care of business with no awkward questions asked. I'm considered the most reliable tracker in the military. Read the details again. I want to see if I've overlooked anything." The other man, who I will call George, for the purposes of my story, fumbled around in his fatigued trouser pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper that had clearly seen much better days. He then proceeded to unroll the paper and read the following. It is Operation Ozark Giant. It is a tall human ape-like creature, approximately 10 foot tall, 1,000 pounds, 5 foot wide, approximately 22-inch footprints, covered in head to toe with thick black hair, an inch long. Powerful, strong, exceedingly dangerous, very potent odour, elusive and difficult to find. Instructions are to kill it along with existing family members, if any are found. Possible location, Ozark waterfalls and open rock pools, nearby forest or caves. Look for broken tree stumps and arched pieces of timber. The other military man, who I will call Mike for my story, stroked his moustache in a gesture of thoughtful contemplation. I wonder why they want us to take him down, he said. Has the creature harmed anyone or caused any mischief? It strikes me that the report is really rather vague. Even that rogue bear I took down last summer was causing more problems to the locals in the area and had a better report than this one, which is about as indefinite as you can get. The whole thing is one hell of a spineless joke. What's the name of the creature, did you say? Sasquatch, sir. Mountain giant, said George. Give me the map, snapped Mike. Where are we? I think we're at this precise point, sir, he said. Maybe we should turn more to the eastern side of the valley. I think we've not investigated that area thoroughly enough. We can set up camp there tonight, and we can set up a night patrol. I think it's possible that the creature could potentially be nocturnal, which may be why he has eluded us so far. If he's intelligent, which is highly possible, he could be erasing his footsteps if he suspects he is being tracked. Good point, but if this creature is as intelligent as you suggest, this expedition is turning out to be a bloody needle in a haystack. How the heck are we going to find such an elusive, clever creature? Once the men had disappeared from my sight, I realised to my utter relief that they weren't actually looking for me, but were hunting some kind of peculiar humanoid ape. I'd been wrong about Celeste. She'd not been intending to get me killed after all, I thought with relief. I determined that these men must be from some kind of military base, and it sounded really odd to me that they were looking for such an anomalous, strange-sounding creature. I'd never heard of such an atypical beast existing in North America before. I'd explored North America so very well, and knew all the animals in explicit detail that frolicked in our woods, and a humanoid ape was definitely not one of those creatures that I'd ever encountered on any of my travels. Surely this was some great big wind-up, I thought, chuckling to myself. Yes, that's probably what it was. The military were well known for their warped sense of humour, but this was possibly taking things a teensy-weensy bit overboard as far as a wind-up was concerned, I thought. That night I retired to my hammock very early. I'd made a fire pit as I knew those men were far away by now. I killed a rabbit and skinned it, roasting it over the grill and flavouring it with mixed seasonings. It tasted exactly like roast chicken, and it was melt in the mouth and juicy. I immediately pulled my fire pit apart and smoothed the area down and covered myself with a natural citronella lemongrass insect repellent and proceeded to lie down in my hammock, covering myself with a sopping wet towel. It was such a hot, humid night, and it's very difficult to fall asleep when the weather is this clammy and unpleasant, and the flying, biting insects don't make life any easier as far as acquiring a good night's sleep is concerned. I did manage to finally drift off to sleep with the help of my wet towel that helped my body temperature to drop quite substantially, thus enabling me to get some well-needed shut-eye. I suddenly awoke to the loud noise of splashing in the water, and I could hear these strange chattering sounds that sounded as if someone was speaking gibberish, but it sounded like several people jabbering all at once in a very peculiar, strange tongue. There was also a horrible stench in the air that smelt a lot like sweaty trainers and wet dogs. What the heck, I thought to myself, as I sprang into action and gathered up my rifle. I crept silently through the trees, taking fastidious care to be as soundless as I possibly could. I stepped ever closer to the rocky pools with the magnificent white foaming cascading waterfalls, and that was when I saw them. There were 4 massive creatures that at first glance looked exactly like bears, but then I realized they were more like human giants, covered with long, flowing, dark brown hair. They were all playing together in the rocky pool, excitedly chattering together, garrulously, in a language of some kind, and the dialogue was continuous, as they absolutely loved to chat. I realized all at once that it was a mother, father, and 2 children, and they were without doubt the humanoid apes that those military men had been authorized and instructed to kill by their superiors at a military base of some kind. The very thought made me sick to my stomach, because to me killing these creatures was unequivocally murder. The behaviour of these powerful, majestic, lofty humanoids was so human-like it was utterly incredible. I kept up close to the rock pool, hiding behind a large rocky outcrop to watch them closely. They were the most extraordinary, exciting, fascinating creatures that I have ever encountered, because they were incredibly intelligent. I was in luck. It was a bright full moon, and it was incredibly light, crisp evening, with great visibility, because of the starry firmament that provided the most phenomenal visibility over the rocky pool. They clearly possessed human emotions and feelings, which was seen by the way they interacted together. They were tactile, affectionate, and very much a close, loving family unit. I could see that the alpha male or father was the authority, and he was titanic in his immense size and stature. I would say he was easily 11 foot tall, and well over 1,000 pounds, while the female was 8 foot, and the children about 6 feet. The creatures were incredible swimmers, and their long shaggy hair was surprisingly no hindrance at all to their swimming prowess. I think they were hot on this muggy night, which is why they came to swim in the rocky pool, and they all took turns to stand under the showering current of the waterfall. I could tell they were really enjoying the feeling of the invigorating water pulsating across their bodies like an invigorating massage at a spa. I noticed that their hairless grey faces were so human-like, but with a prominent brow ridge and very deep-set brown eyes that appeared to take on a red eye-shine in the dark. The critters were really enjoying themselves splashing around in the water, and if you took away the long hair and reduced their sizes quite considerably, it would be no different to observing a human family interacting and playing together. Sometimes they would make these happy whooping sounds, which I would liken to jubilant, joyful human laughter. I watched the creatures climb out of the water with such grace and agility. They shook their coats like shaggy dogs, sending a shower of rain over a large rocky area. They continued chattering together while gliding away on their long, graceful legs, and they moved with such fluidity and grace. Suddenly after they had gone, the revelation that these 2 military men that I had seen could potentially kill these beautiful creatures sent waves of horror and dread to every single fibre of my being. It would be tantamount to murder in my book, and I knew that they must be stopped. So I hatched an inspirational, cunning plan in my head, and went in search for the men myself, knowing that they were camping in an easterly direction. At first light I arose early as possible, and immediately armed with my compass and map, I hiked for a few hours with my rucksack on my back, until I found myself walking towards the campsite of the 2 military men. The 2 men appeared very surprised to see me. "Who are you?" they asked me, looking at me in horror. "Oh, I'm just a solar camper out here," I said. "It's very nice to see another human face. It's been a long while, you see." I could see the men physically relax, and they warmly, cordially invited me to join them for a cup of tea around the fire pit. "So how long have you been out here?" Mike asked me curiously. "A while," I lied. "I've seen some things I'd rather forget out of here, of course." "Such as what?" asked Mike, raising a quizzical eyebrow. "Well, you wouldn't believe me if I told you," I said. "Try us," said Mike, trying to hide the rising excitement that I could distinctly hear in his voice. Well, I saw a couple of men actually kill a very big family of black humanoid hairy apes. "I heard them say we've cleaned the whole area out of these horrible critters," I said, watching a horrified expression appear on Mike's face as he listened to me intently. I continued, "I never knew animals like this existed before, but I saw all 4 dead corpses of these black hairy ape-like humanoids myself," I lied. You saw them yourself? Are you sure they're dead? Asked Mike, looking quite delighted. Oh, yes, I said. They were as dead as dodos, and these men loaded them into their truck and sped away just like that. Did they say where they were taking them? Asked Mike, looking frightfully concerned for a moment. To be incinerated. That's what I heard them say, he said. They wanted to keep what they had done very hush-hush, away from prying and questioning human eyes, I gather. We believe your story, said Mike, looking very solemn. But our advice to you is that you don't tell anyone what you saw, because people would think you're cuckoo and that you should be locked away in a loony bin if you even suggest that there are creatures like this loitering around the Ozarks. Do you understand? Oh, you're right, I told them both. I would never, ever tell anyone what I told you. I think I just sensed that both you would believe me. But normally I wouldn't share such stories with anybody else, lest they thought I was bonkers. Glad to hear it, said Mike. How can you be sure these creatures are actually dead, he continued. Are you absolutely certain of this fact? I've been a hunter all my life. I think I know when an animal is dead. The men seemed satisfied by my adamancy. I drank my tea and ate a couple of chocolate biscuits they had given me. I then left the men and thanked them for their hospitality, and then I proceeded to hide behind the cover of a tree. I wanted to listen to their conversation, to make absolutely certain that they would not consider hunting down those beautiful humanoid apes. I truly hoped that my bogus story had convinced them that the humanoid apes were indeed dead. Well, it appears that someone has taken care of our job for us, said Mike. Didn't I tell you that those critters were no longer around? I would have discovered their tracks by now. I'm an awesome tracker, always have been. It's just as well we ran into that man and he told us that the creatures are clearly dead. Or we could have been running around in circles, looking for the ugly critters with no results. Yes, boss, it would appear so. Now, you're not to tell anyone that we didn't kill those Ozark giants ourselves. We'll simply tell them we've taken care of business. That way we'll be esteemed very highly and even promoted. So no divulging any details about this case, do you understand? Why should some stranger take credit when the army will not know the difference? So no spilling the beans. Get my drift? Of course, sir, said George. We'll simply say we attended to business. Good man, said Mike, tapping him on the back. I knew I could trust you. I watched the two men pack away their tents into their rucksacks and leave the area, falsely believing that the humanoid apes had been killed. So there you are. That's my extraordinary story. And I'm glad to say I think I played my part in hopefully saving those beautiful family of forest giants that deserved a life like anybody else does. You will be surprised to learn that all these years later I am still married to Celeste, and it would appear that over the years our relationship really blossomed. Initially we did have little in common, and it really looked doubtful that our relationship would actually work. But then, one day, it just suddenly did. I fell in love with her about 10 years into our marriage. She suddenly changed, and I guess I did too. Maybe we just grew up and matured, and instead of growing apart, we grew together. I think Celeste overcame her self-centered behaviour and developed a more spiritual attitude to life. She developed into a very beautiful woman over the years, and I love her more than ever. I always tell her that she improved with age, just like a good quality wine. At first she was fruity and light and naive, but now she's full-bodied, mature, and infinitely superior. I'm also glad to report that I do go out on camping trips, but not alone anymore these days, because Celeste has developed a passion for outdoor adventure, and she adores visiting the Ozarks as much as I do, and swimming in those glorious rock pools, and cooking gnocchi and garlic and parmesan on a hot pan over a warm grill. Oh, and I do still have that hefty life insurance policy taken out on me. But I assure you that if Celeste wanted to do me in, she could have done so a long time ago. She relentlessly teases me about the time I thought that she had hired someone to do me in. I now know all these years later that the creatures I encountered in the Ozarks were in fact Bigfoots, and I do realise how privileged I was to have such an amazing encounter with these hairy humanoids that I believe are the most wonderful, clever and intelligent creatures. I'm sure like the human species you get good and bad ones, but the family I watched playing in the rocky pool so happily together was not a threat to human safety. I am certain of this fact, or I would have not gone to such extraordinary lengths to protect them. That I can assure you. So that is my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Wayne, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1998, when I was 18 years old. I grew up as an only child raised by my single mother in a humble, modest area of Seattle, where we resided in a tiny, respectable suburban dwelling that was the most dilapidated residence in the entire street. Put it this way, it was much more in need of some TLC to put it back into pristine shape. My mother was incredibly embarrassed by the appearance of our meagre home, as we had peeling paint everywhere on the exterior walls and a leaking roof. She would tell me that houses were exactly like people, and when they grew older they needed the help of a very good plastic surgeon to creatively put them back together again. She assured me that plastic surgeons were very expensive to come by, so some houses were literally forced to age disgracefully through no fault of their own. I remember thinking that our poor little lowly house was like little Humpty Dumpty that could not be put back together again, and it made me very, very sad. My mother worked so incredibly hard as a dental hygienist to cover all our bills, but it was never easy for her as a single parent. My father had died when I was only 5 years old of pancreatic cancer. I had no memory of him whatsoever. My mother must have loved him terribly because she always had his picture on her nightstand, and she would relentlessly read all the piles of love letters he had written to her over the years. I knew she must have adored him so much because I would always see her wiping away the tears after she had studied a picture of him. Growing up, she had absolutely no interest in dating whatsoever, as her priority was literally focused on raising me. In truth, she was a phenomenal mother with the biggest, most generous and loving heart. One day when I was only a little boy whom had just finished my first year at a local school in the area, I was standing in line to speak to Father Christmas at a local department store in Seattle. I couldn't wait, but I remember I got pinched on my back by a very mischievous-looking boy who was called Peter, and he was giggling so much. So I started trying to pinch him back, and then I had to chase him all around the department store while our parents were keeping our places in the queue. Before long, Peter and I became firm, best friends. We were quite literally like brothers and were inseparable. I remember spending copious amounts of time at his opulent, prestigious mansion in Seattle, where literally no expense had been spared. The grand palatial-looking mansion rather reminded me of the White House in Washington, and even my mother remarked of the stark similarity in appearance. It was not long before Peter's father literally begged my mother to pay for my school fees and all my expenses required for me to go to some ostentatious private school with his son. He told my mother that Peter was his only son, and that I was the nearest thing to a brother to him, and it would be an absolute privilege to pay for my school fees. My mother thought all her Christmases had come at once, because she'd always dreamed of sending me to a phenomenal school with an awesome reputation like this one had. So you can imagine we were thrilled. At school, Pete and I became as thick as thieves, and people often believed we were non-identical twins because we were so close. While all this was happening, my mother's house was falling apart at the seams, and she was getting some verbal abuse and intensive remarks from really nasty neighbours, who told her that her house was shrinking the value of the homes in the area and ruining the look of the entire streets. I remember telling Peter about the abuse that my mother was receiving from some of the stinging neighbours who were not slow in coming forward in expressing their disapprobation. If you cannot afford the repairs to your home, sell up and buy a smaller place. You're ruining the look of our street with your run-down-looking shack. When I told Peter the sad story about the incessant abuse my mother was receiving from her neighbours, I kid you not, within a day or so, his generous father stepped in and gallantly completely renovated our home by transforming it from the lowliest dwelling in our street to quite literally the most glamorous opulent home, with luxurious finishes and fittings. In truth, it really was way too prestigious a home for our area. But who was complaining? I wasn't. My mother told me that the neighbours who'd previously snubbed her were now inviting her to all their parties. Isn't that typical? I remember her telling me that some people falsely believed that the more money you had, the greater value and worth you had as a human being, which was a very ugly, big lie, because some of the most beautiful, unassuming people in the world, and the most honest and reliable, were poor, and I was to never ever forget that. To this day, I still emphatically believe that money can never define who we are as individuals, or our authentic worth and value as human beings on this planet. One day when I was 18 years old, Peter invited me to stay at his uncle's very prestigious hunting estate here in North America. We were not staying at his estate during the hunting season, even though, of course, even off-season, they still did have guests. As you can imagine, Peter and I were so excited and over the moon to get this invite, but I would like to keep the location of where this hunting estate actually was located very, very secret, if you don't mind, for the protection of the estate itself and the Bigfoot I was ultimately to encounter, because all these years later there are still frequent reports of Bigfoot sightings on the estate, and I would not want to contribute to invading their privacy. When Pete and I arrived at the hunting estate for a 2-week vacation, even his uncle said he could hardly tell us apart. "My word," he said, "it is true. Your father was absolutely right. You both look like twins." The weird thing was that we actually did, in a strange way, as peculiar as that may sound, although I have heard it said before that you do become like the company you keep. We both had black wavy hair, olive skin, blue eyes, and were just under 6 foot tall, and were quite lanky. Peter's uncle was an amazing man, and he actively encouraged us to really enjoy the facilities on his hunting estate, which we most certainly took full advantage of. We were riding quad bikes, mountain bikes, playing golf, fishing at the lake, horse riding, swimming, and exploring the beautiful, well-maintained forests that were full of large oak trees, firs, spruces and maples, and were teeming with an abundance of indigenous wildlife, and some of the deers were the most sizable specimens with the largest, most impressive antlers that I have ever seen in my life. I could truly see why this hunting estate was booked up every year by eager hunters from all over the globe who wanted to enjoy their hand at some hunting. The estate offered luxurious accommodation, including individual cabins, very delicious homely food, and all kinds of other outdoor pursuits, and it was located in an exquisite location surrounded by panoramic views of rolling emerald green hills, mountainous valleys, rugged rocky outcrops, and imposing statuesque waterfalls, meandering pebbly streams with imposing rock-like formations, and of course a very large silvery lake that was a haven for bird life from fish eagles to the wild duck. Pete and I were sharing a small, whimsical, rather enchanting and lavishly decorated little Swiss-style music box wooden cabin that was flanked by a large wooded area. I remember I was woken up suddenly one morning at about 4 a.m. to the sounds of very definite gunshots. I immediately started to shake Peter vigorously. "Get up," I said, "get up! I think there's a poacher on your uncle's land. It's not even hunting season. Someone is illegally shooting. Get up, Peter, get up!" But Peter was a very deep sleeper and grumbled, telling me, "It's probably nothing, and get back to sleep." I was still in my pyjamas and was about to return to bed when I heard some more ominous gunshots. Something was clearly going on, I thought, and I needed to get to the bottom of it now. This time I was wide awake and fully alert. I quickly put on some shoes and, armed with my rifle and flashlight, I bolted out of the cabin as fast as I possibly could. Suddenly I saw him. There was a man running out of the woods that I was in no doubt was a poacher. He was up to no good. There was something distinctly shifty and duplicitous about this slippery character. He was holding his rifle and looking back towards the woods very, very furtively, almost as if he was half expecting to be pounced on by a predator who was in pursuit of him. It was that kind of concerned look. "Excuse me, sir," I said. "This is private land. What on earth are you doing here?" The young man scowled at me. He was dressed in a scruffy red T-shirt and jeans, and he looked at me with a guilty, sheepish expression written all over his face, and I knew unequivocally that he had just done something heinously evil, but I couldn't imagine what. I just sensed it and felt it in my gut. "What have you done?" I asked him. "What on earth have you done?" Then I heard it, the most terrifying scream, such of the likes that I have never heard before in my life. It truly sounded like a woman was being murdered. It was that piercing that even my chest vibrated under the sound. It was just terrifying. It was the most god-awful sound that I have ever heard. "What the hell have you done?" I shrieked. "Have you just murdered someone?" I screamed. "Your wife, perhaps, or some poor girl?" The man looked at me with a look of terror on his face, as if he was guilty as hell, and as if he'd been caught red-handed. And suddenly he just bolted off as fast as you can imagine. In that moment, I imagined this insidiously wicked and evil man had literally dragged a woman into the woods and murdered her in cold blood. There was no doubt that he was up to something. Did I chase after him and catch him, or go after the woman who may well be dead by now, the woman that had been screaming? I knew instinctively that there was a small chance that she could still be fighting for her life. Then I heard the horrifying scream all over again. A woman I now knew was in very definite serious distress, so I charged into the woods as fast as I could, searching for the anguished woman. There she was, squatting under a large oak tree, and she was lamenting, wailing and screaming as if she was in agonizing, inconsolable pain, and I could see why, because she was squatting over the dead body of a deceased loved one, and she was in a terrible, frantic state. I could sense and feel her agonizing, dreadful pain. I watched in absolute horror as she tried to shake the body, as if she was trying to bring it back to life, but it was completely useless because the body was very definitely dead, and it was not coming back to life. I just stood there in utter awe, watching this very tragic scene unfold before my very eyes, and tears of sorrow were pouring down my face. This woman who was grieving and pining so desperately was a colossal creature of about 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and 4 feet wide. And yet, even though she was not human, she had such a human quality to her that was completely undeniable. I noticed she had very long arms, and that she was exceedingly muscular, with an enviable athletic body, that it was impressively strong, lofty, and majestic. For a moment I stood still, not knowing what to do. But then, on a burst of irrational emotional impulsiveness, I rushed towards this ape-like humanoid and cradled her in my arms, without any concern for my safety whatsoever. In that moment I didn't care about my own vulnerability, because my desire to comfort her far exceeded and outweighed any fear that I actually felt towards this creature. I think sensing and feeling this female's raw pain and desperate suffering was utterly intolerable for me to just stand and watch, and I simply had to reassure her in some way. I had to relieve her of the tortured distress and insurmountable grief that she was feeling. The joke was I was so small and pathetically puny in contrast to this colossal creature that I could not even wrap my arms around her gargantuan form. However, that was not even remotely significant, because she responded warmly to my touch, and even ran her large hands through my hair, ruffling it up affectionately with her sausage-sized fingers, so that it stood up in spikes. I believe that this was an expression of affectionate appreciation for me. I do remember I could hear her heart pounding through her hairy chest, and even feel her soft breasts against my body, because I was that close to her. She was whimpering exactly like a dog that's distressed, and was patting my back with her big hands, and I could feel that she was so comforted and reassured by my presence. I knew that my physical touch had been exactly what she needed right now, and I had succeeded in comforting her. I was so grateful for that. I did not want to be alone. I did not want her to be alone in her grief, and I had no idea if she had any other family member who might be there to help her in this grievous time. I certainly hoped that she did, because I couldn't bear to think of her alone in her suffering. After a while I pulled away and she looked at me with her big, sad, rusty-coloured eyes and pointed very, very sadly to the dead body that lay on the ground. I examined the brawny, sinewy, hefty body and discovered some gunshots on its head, chest and shoulders. There were so many, it was unbelievable. My fingers were now covered in blood from my inspection. I realised that this poor creature had not stood a chance and had been assaulted by bullets and killed by the poacher in the woods that had run away so furtively and so hastily. The hairy humanoid chattered away to me in a language that I couldn't understand, that sounded remarkably like gibberish, and then she physically acted out to me what had happened by miming the man with the gun, whom on seeing the male creature had clearly just fired several rounds at the critter without discrimination. The dead hairy humanoid was titanic in size and was easily over 1,000 pounds, and yes, he was scary, he was intimidating and terrifying to look at, but that didn't excuse being assaulted at with so many bullets. However, from what the creature communicated to me, this large ape-like humanoid had done nothing to deserve being killed like this, because he hadn't imposed any threat whatsoever, and had intended the man no harm. He had only been interested and curious in the human, and had been peeking at him from behind a tree, and had accidentally been spotted by the sharp beady eyes of the poacher, who had run after him, shooting aggressively for many, many rounds. In my book, this creature was so human-like, it was equivalent to being murdered, and I began to feel this enraged anger and fury towards the poacher rising up in the back of my throat like a huge wave of nausea. I really wanted to puke in absolute disgust, as this man should not have killed this creature in cold blood like this, and clearly this was not a case of self-defence. I watched the very distressed, stoic creature digging away the ground with her very large hands, using a large stone to remove the soil, which by all appearances was exceedingly hard to shift, but believe me, she made light work of it. She made it look easy. It must have taken her only 20 minutes to dig this massive grave. She then literally rolled her partner's body into the grave very, very slowly, and then jumped in the grave to be with him. She was stroking his body for a very long time, whimpering and touching him, and then finally she jumped out of the grave. It was then that I helped her pile and layer the soil back into the grave, and we began to create a huge burial mound together. The creature then gathered some massively large stones that would have been impossible for a man to lift, but she picked them up with effortless ease as if they weighed nothing, and encircled them around the grave, and finally she picked a couple of sticks and placed them on a grave in what looked like a very deliberate sign. Finally she sat down grievously and continued to whimper, but I used my words to comfort and reassure her, and I even sang her some songs. I think my voice did soothe her, because she looked grateful, and she appeared to be nodding her head in time to my singing. That wasn't very tuneful, I might add. I got up and indicated that I was going away, but I would be coming back very shortly. I really sensed she understood what I was trying to communicate, which was amazing, because I'm not the best of actors. At this time it was about 8 in the morning, I imagine, and I thundered excitedly into the main kitchen, like a rhino at full charge, nearly knocking over the shocked chef, who eyed me with a startled, rather bedraggled look on his face. "I've never seen anyone this eager for breakfast before," he said. The cook was preparing breakfast for his distinguished, esteemed guests, because even when it's not hunting season on the estate, they still invariably have guests staying, who book the cabins on the land and enjoy the extracurricular activities on offer, like horse riding, fishing and hiking. The chef who prepares the scrumptious morning buffet breakfasts was rather surprised to see me piling plastic lunchboxes with copious amounts of crispy bacon, ham, cheeses, scrambled eggs, warm crisp potato wedges, sliced fruit, crisp vegetables, guacamole and cereals, not to mention bottles of juice. I told the surprised chef that I was having a picnic, who regarded me as if I was a starved prisoner of war being exposed to food for the first time. "You must be hungry," he said. "That's enough for 20 people. "I'm starved," I lied. I could eat for 20 people. I then proceeded to scurry out of the kitchen as fast as I could, very, very eagerly, so much so that a few eyes watched me racing out with my hands loaded with food parcels. I did happen to overhear conversations of people asking each other if they had heard gunshots at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and it did seem to appear that indeed gunshots had not escaped the people's staying attention. I said nothing and ran into the woods, where the female creature was sitting by her partner's grave, and she had been expecting me and waiting patiently. When I opened the plastic containers, she was chattering away excitedly, looking absolutely jubilant. She opened the plastic containers eagerly, like a kid unwrapping Christmas presents at Christmas, and opened each container as if she couldn't wait to see what was inside. She let out a very excited whoop, which made me laugh. I could sense her jubilation, and we sat under the oak tree, eagerly eating together. And I've never ever eaten with anyone that appreciated every mouthful as much as this creature did. When she ate the crispy bacon, she looked at me with her golden eyes, and they lit up with pleasure, and she moaned with ecstasy when she ate the bacon, eggs, potatoes, and hams that she just absolutely loved. We sat there for ages, enjoying each other's company, as if we'd been friends all our lives. The creature was ravenously hungry and literally licked the plastic containers completely clean. And then she handed them back to me, but I showed her how you could use the Tupperware containers to keep stuff in, and then she understood what I was trying to tell her. She decided that she would keep the containers as a gift. She was so pleased, she picked up pebbles from the forest floor and shook them in the plastic containers rather like a rattle, and looked up at me with bright, rather amused eyes. She was so appreciative and thankful. Finally, she indicated that she needed to go, as she pointed towards the mountainous valleys where I imagined she actually lived. It was densely forested up there, with some hilly, rocky ravines. I immediately hugged her, and was enfolded by her massive form, and felt her incredible warmth and love wrapped around me. It was like being in the arms of something that was so big and so loving. It was probably as close as I was ever going to get to feel the love of God around me. I'm not ashamed to say that I started crying because I was so sad to see her go. And I wanted to spend so much more time with her because she enchanted me, and she was so human-like, so accepting, and just so authentic. When I told Peter what had transpired, he was absolutely enraged with me for not waking him up. I did try, I assured him, but you refused to budge. I cannot believe you have such an incredible experience without me, he complained. It's not fair that I missed out. You say the creature looked like a human and an ape. Please can't you take me to her now? What kind of animal do you suppose she is? Oh, please let's go and find her. Look, she's gone home, I said, so you won't be able to see her. I'm really sorry you missed out, but you will sleep in late. You know the saying, the early bird catches the worm. You caught more than a worm, my friend. You saw a humanoid ape, a creature that nobody else has seen. Peter and I decided to leave a large box of delicious food by the grave full of crispy bacon and sumptuous treats, as well as a photograph of me on the box, because I wanted her to look at that photograph and remember me for years to come. And we arranged garlands of flowers around the grave in memory of her fallen partner. I was sure she would come back to visit the grave, retrieve the treats, and be delighted by what we'd done. I did never see the Bigfoot ever again, sadly, but the next day on the doorstep of my cabin, I was to discover the hugest pair of antlers I've ever seen in my life, which I knew immediately was a gift from her. The question that perturbed me for many years to come was how she'd known that I was staying at that particular cabin. Maybe they have a sense of smell, just like dogs do, I don't know. When Peter's uncle actually saw my antlers, he said they were the most impressive antlers he'd ever seen in his life. And today they're still hanging in prime position on my living room wall and attract a lot of questions from guests, but I never ever tell them the story. To cut a long story short, Peter lost his mother to breast cancer 3 years after my encounter with this creature, and my mother and his father actually got together and got married a year after that, I kid you not. It really is extraordinary how life can work out in the funniest and the most peculiar of ways. Peter and I officially became brothers, And all these years later, we are still best friends. And our wives, believe it or not, are both sisters from the same family, which is another peculiar irony of ironies. I am now convinced that there's no such thing as a coincidence in this world of ours, because sometimes things do happen for the very strangest of reasons. The beautiful, majestic creature that I encountered in the woods, I now know to be a Bigfoot, a Yeti, a Sasquatch, or a hairy man. I like to call her a Bigfoot. I hope she has found another partner and raised her own family by now. I got the impression that she was young when I met her, so I'm sure she could have started all over again, and I hope she did. I have no regrets of reaching out to a Bigfoot in her time of insurmountable sorrow and grief, even if the consequences had been far different. So that is my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Chantel and I'm initially from Pennsylvania, but my Bigfoot encounter happened to me in 1978 when I was only 15 years old at the time, and my family had moved to a small rural town in the Pacific Northwest. My father had been offered an amazing job running a dairy farm for a farmer who'd been paralysed from the waist down from a dreadful accident where his tractor had accidentally rolled over his torso. It was a horrifying ordeal, and he was lucky to be alive. Ralph the farmer was zealously enthusiastic about all his cows, despite his disabling condition, and he wanted nothing better than to preserve his farm. So he hired my father, who was being paid handsomely, to take charge of his dairy herd and to manage the business on his behalf. And his delightful wife Patsy was now relegated to being a full-time carer on the farm, giving her husband, Ralph, the full-time care that he actually needed. And she was desirous for nothing more than to take care of him, because she absolutely loved the bones of him. My dad loved nothing better than getting his hands really dirty, and had always revelled in the great outdoors and was fervently passionate about cows. Growing up as a young boy, his grandfather had owned a large dairy farm, so there was nothing that fired him up more than working with cows, and as a young boy he had known everything there was to know about running a dairy farm, which he had aspired to do all his young life. However, his own parents had their own fanciful, bright ideas for their son's future, and imposed their indomitable will on him, as well as actively encouraging, persuading, and unrelentingly bullying my father to embrace the corporate world, which was not in his blood at all. I think his pertinacious parents falsely believed that there was no future in dairy farming, and that real money was to be made behind a desk in the office. Little did they realise how wrong they were to impose their idealistic views and principles on my father. My father quite literally despised and detested every minute of office life, and dreaded getting up early in the morning to go to the office that was so devoid of cheerful birdsong in the valley and the fresh air blowing against his face. One day he decided that he could not stand another day in an office inundated with telephone calls, faxes, urgent messages, officers' lunches, and copious amounts of coffee to calm down his frazzled nerves. As you can imagine, I was devastated to be leaving behind all my amazing friends and my school, as were both my two sisters, Polly 13 and Annabelle, who was 12. But we all knew how thrilled both my parents were about embarking upon this exciting adventure with a brand new life in the countryside, so we chose to embrace this great opportunity with a very positive, upbeat attitude. The short-term temporary plan was that we were to move into a rural neighbourhood and buy a house there, which we would eventually sell. The long-term outlook was that we were going to build our brand new dream farmhouse that was to be developed on the ample acreage of the dairy farm, which would mean that the land would boast 2 rural dwellings. This idea had been Ralph's suggestion, and it would work exceedingly well because my father, being close to the dairy herd, was very significant, especially in the likely event that you might have a cow giving birth in the early hours of the morning, so being on hand 24/7 was ultimately a necessity on a large dairy farm, where the activities of the herd are not dictated by a 9-to-5 schedule. I remember the day we moved to our brand new home in the rural town that was in very close proximity to the dairy farm where my father was to begin working. I was actually beginning to feel incredibly excited because the whole area was remarkably serene, peaceful, and exquisitely beautiful. The house we'd bought was a standard symmetrical design like all the other properties in our street, which had a very large backyard, a beautiful swimming pool, and a generous-sized back porch. All the houses in our street looked remarkably similar, but had very enchanting, beautiful terraced gardens, and were painted in bright apricot, with green roofs, green wooden windows, and green front doors. Everyone had their own fenced-in backyard, but the front area of our homes were fronted by a large open area of manicured lawn. We lived on a white gravel road, and our backyards overlooked exquisite views of mountainous valleys and emerald green rolling hills. On the opposite side of our street was a high grassy embankment, which stretched out into a wide open clearing, which was then flanked by a vast area of natural forest that literally stretched back for miles. These forests consisted of towering, majestic Douglas and vine maples, as well as Pacific, silver and grand fir trees, and it was also teeming with an abundance of indigenous wildlife to the area, like the typical mule and white-tailed deers that we would see looking in at us from the edges of the forest, and sometimes we would see them early in the morning on the green outside our homes, scampering around. I remember we were unpacking and unloading large cardboard boxes filled with kitchen crockery that we were subsequently placing in the kitchen cabinets. We were chattering excitedly among ourselves, and our elevated voices were raised in animated childlike enthusiasm about our exciting move. Suddenly I looked out of the window and saw a crotchety-looking man standing only yards away from our window with a huge crabby scowl planted on his wrinkled face. He was shaking his white head of thinning hair with a very evident look of disapproval and exasperated frustration. I sensed almost immediately that he was not pleased with our excited, animated, enthusiastic screams, but I do not believe we had been that raucous or loud, but clearly he begged to disagree. My mother observed this grumpy-looking, cantankerous man as she glanced out of the kitchen window that overlooked the front yard and the long stretch of green lawn outside all the properties of our street. As she unwrapped the crockery from the layers of newspaper and placed it into the kitchen cabinet, I remember her saying to us, "That must be our new next-door neighbour," she sighed. "Oh dear, he does look like a crusty, miserable old sod, doesn't he?" I thought personally that he was very creepy, and he had a thin, scrawny, chicken-like legs and an extended stomach overhang, and he looked like he was in his early 60s, but his small, squished-up eyes looked exactly like a bull terrier's, and he was equally as unfriendly and vicious-looking towards strangers. That was clear to me. This morose man just stood there, goggling and gawking at us through the kitchen window, and he didn't seem concerned or perturbed that he was being so rude and invasive towards us. He looked just like a barn owl regarding a mouse. It really was an awkward feeling to be so scrutinized so intently by this neighbour. Finally he stopped goggling us and boldly pounded on our front door with 3 very menacing loud raps that sounded as sinister and airy as something out of a horror movie. My mother answered the door to this horrible, surly-looking man. I noticed that he was still scowling and looking decidedly churlish. "I'm your neighbour," he said, "and I live next door. I'd appreciate your children lowering the volume and tone of their voices. This is a quiet neighbourhood, and the residents here do not appreciate children screaming and making a ruckus commotion." "Of course," said my mother. "I'm very sorry. My children are just a little excited and animated, that's all. I didn't realise they were being that noisy." "Mind that you keep the noise down," said the man, and he stomped away like an angry bull. "I told you he was a gloomy sod," sighed my mother. "Just our luck to end up living next door to the old codger. I've got a funny feeling that this isn't the last that we've heard from him. I think he's not going to be plain sailing living next door to someone as waspish and as snappy as he is. I think a hammerback shark would be instantly preferable to him and friendlier than he is. Oh, he is decidedly odd, I'll give him that, and very cold." Fast forward a few weeks and we had settled down superbly into our brand new home, and life was remarkably good. My mother had literally transformed our dwelling into a sumptuous, cosy, congenial den, and had wallpapered and painted the interiors, and it was beginning to feel very snug and homely indeed. I'd also never seen my father happier and more jubilant in his entire life, and even the pale skin that he had developed a golden hue from all the time he spent basking in the warm rays of the sun. I could see that he was in his element. I noticed he'd get up at the crack of dawn to drive his Dodger to the dairy farm, and all the conversations around our dinner table were all about cows. And when my father talked about his dairy herd, I'm not kidding when I say that his face became animated and jubilant, I'd never seen him so vivacious, lively, and passionate about anything before, and his joyful countenance was literally infectious, creating a warm, cosy, happy atmosphere in our home. My mother was so used to the city that she began to settle down into country life like a duck to water, as if she'd never ever been apart from it. She was in her element, growing vegetables in the backyard, which was something she'd never ever done before, and watching the seeds develop into plants was something that she marvelled and admired. We were benefiting greatly from the fruits of my father's industrious, copious labours by drinking the most delicious creamy milk I've ever tasted, and we had phenomenal homemade butter and cheese. It didn't get better than that. In our spare time, my sister and I would ride our bikes down the road, and we would also play in the woods with Fido and Chloe, our two cocker spaniels. I began to really cherish life in the countryside because it was so remarkable. There was one exception, of course, and that was our crotchety old neighbour, that every time we would fly past him, tinkering our bicycle bells, I'd hear him say, "Bloody children, those bloody children," and I'd always shout out, "I heard you, I heard you, I know what you said." It wasn't long before we started receiving pieces of paper with magazine words cut out and stuck on the paper posted through our letterbox, very, very suspiciously. The letters would read, "Shut up or ship out for good." Then another time we would receive a note that read, "If your kids do not shut up, I'll shut them up for you and for good." We all knew that those nasty notes that kept invading our lives like a deadly virus were from that horrible next-door neighbour of ours, but my mother chose to ignore them and told us not to worry about it. "He's just an old codger," she said. "The worst he can do is call the police, and you're not making a lot of noise, so there's not much that they can do." I imagine the nasty man absolutely loathes children. Perhaps he's never had kids of his own. Or perhaps he just hates people in general. You do get people like that, you know. One day on our doorstep we found several bottles of Coca-Cola, and my mother brought them all in, believing that they'd accidentally been left in the car after a shopping trip, and that my father had left them on our doorstep for us to put away in the pantry. One dinner my sister got some of those bottles of Coke out from the pantry to have with our dinner. I remember we were eating roast chicken, roast potatoes, gravy, vegetables and cauliflower cheese. My mother was a really good cook, and we always sat around the kitchen table together for dinner every single night. I remember taking a sip of the Coke and saying, "It's a little flat," and I hated flat Coke, so I just did not drink it at all, but opted for some creamy chocolate milk instead. My sisters, on the other hand, were enjoying their Cokes that appeared to have been carbonated, but within 30 minutes after drinking those Cokes, both my sisters became incredibly ill. At first my mother began to worry that there was something wrong with the chicken she had cooked, but the rest of the family was fine, so it couldn't have been what we'd eaten. Annabelle was vomiting, and she was groggy and speaking with a slurred speech, sounding exactly like someone who'd just got a stroke. And my other sister, Polly, was so lacking in coordination and was literally falling all over the place and couldn't stand up straight. She was complaining bitterly that her stomach was hurting and she wanted to throw up. My mother knew immediately that something was intrinsically wrong with both of my sisters. I remember they were taken to the hospital by ambulance and literally rushed there. I still recall our grumpy neighbour watching my two sisters being rolled into the back of the ambulance onto the stretchers, and I recall that the miserable old codger of a next-door neighbour was actually smiling from ear to ear, which made me sick to my stomach. I was so disgusted that he was delighting in my sister's misfortune. Over the next few days, things got progressively worse for my sisters, as the doctors could not understand what was wrong with them, because their bodies appeared to be shutting down. It was one of the most harrowing and anguishing times of our entire life, as my parents thought that they were going to lose their children, and I thought I was going to lose both of my sisters, who were my best friends. One of the very intuitive, on-the-ball doctors, I'm glad to say, decided to run some tests for poisoning, and then they discovered traces of glycolic acid and formaldehyde in their bodies, which they believed were from antifreeze. The police were called to investigate the case immediately, and they literally raided our pantries, testing every conceivable product for antifreeze that we possessed in our entire home. The antifreeze was finally discovered in one of the Coca-Cola bottles that was still remaining. My mother remembered the Coca-Cola that she discovered on the doorstep, and also talked to the police about the insidious notes that we had been posted by our nasty neighbour, who clearly had an axe to grind with us, because that was the thing the police wanted to know. Was there someone who wished us harm? And actually the only person that we could think about was our grumpy neighbour. After these revelations, the police investigated our neighbour's house, and they found bottles of antifreeze in his store cupboards and other Coke bottles he had tampered with, which were poisoned with antifreeze that he was probably intending on using on us later. He had surreptitiously poisoned all the bottles of Coke, as he was desirous to kill us all, and he never believed he'd ever get caught, which was amazing. I still remember the day he was arrested by that police. He was spitting on the ground at my mother and I, as we watched him being dragged, kicking and protesting angrily to the police car. "I wish I'd killed the lot of you," he spouted, "the whole bloody lot of you." It was discovered that this was not the first time our nasty neighbour had attempted to kill people with antifreeze, so my mother was right. He didn't just have a vendetta against children, he also hated people. It was discovered that the deaths of 2 of his previous wives had been deemed very suspicious and had presented with similar symptoms to both of my sisters, but as the formaldehyde had not been discovered in their systems, our neighbour had literally got away with murdering them quite easily without ever being detected. But I'm glad to say his duplicitous acts finally caught up with him, as invariably they usually will. While my sisters were in hospital, it was a tumultuous time for my parents, who were so wrapped up in worry and concern over my sisters that I began to feel very discluded, isolated, lonely and estranged. As a result, I began to spend copious amounts of time in the woods. Every day, much to the delight of my rambunctious cocker spaniels, I would take them for a long walk and play with them with a ball around the stream that meandered through the woods. It was such an enchanting idyllic spot in the woods, and the pebbly stream, dotted with some sculptural-looking rocks, possessed a swift current that literally jetted through the valley. I enjoyed dangling my feet in the cool water and listening to the lovely crashing sounds of the water thundering against the rocks. It was very relaxing and calming, exactly what I needed. I indulged myself in watching my 2 dogs playing around in the shallow parts of the stream. My dogs were not keen swimmers, but they appreciated splashing around in the shallow end and catching sticks or balls that I would throw for them. Once they retrieved a ball and a stick, they would immediately return it to me for me to throw them again. They were very clever and well-trained dogs. For me personally, going to the woods was healing for my soul and clarifying and clearing for my mind, because nearly losing both my sisters to this lethal poisoning had been one of the most horrifying nightmares in my young life, and I could have also been there, in that hospital bed, fighting for my life, if I had actually drunk that Coca-Cola. I was thanking my lucky stars that I had opted for chocolate milk instead. I did find solace in the woods. It was such a great place to meditate, and to take stock of things and to reflect. One day, as I was sitting by the stream and throwing sticks for my dogs, I suddenly noticed that someone mysterious was throwing sticks for Fido, and Fido was in turn wagging his tail furiously as if he was in heaven. He went scampering back to the stranger as fast as he could, with his jaws locked over the stick. Fido had always been an assiduous, discriminating dog, and was so much less inclined to be friendly to strangers. But Chloe was usually the gregarious, uninhibited one. On this occasion it was Fido that was very amenable towards the stranger that was throwing sticks to him, but it was the flamboyant, boisterous Chloe that usually wasn't afraid of anyone that appeared to be keeping her distance. Fido clearly loved this elusive, somewhat mysterious stranger, whoever they were, who appeared to be keeping their distance from me as well, I noticed. The flamboyant Chloe appeared to be far less forthcoming. I didn't know what to think. Was it not rude for a stranger to interfere with a game that you were playing with your dogs, I wondered in surprise. Why was this stranger keeping such a distance and not introducing themselves to me? I watched the stick go flying towards Fido, who scuttled towards the stick and sprinted back towards the stranger with his jaws once again clutching the stick, which invariably I knew he would drop at the stranger's feet for him to throw again. I knew that was happening because that's how Fido always played the game. He was a very intelligent dog. I watched his tail wagging so exuberantly, and he was making the most delighted yaps that I've never heard him make before. I noticed when he kept returning to collect with the stick, he stank to high heaven as if he'd been rolling in something unmentionable and disgusting. It smelt a little bit like cheesy trainers. Every time Fido went back to the stranger to return the stick, I would hear this very strange chattering sound that sounded exactly like a monkey. It was very odd. I remember that I just couldn't understand what it could be. I immediately got up in awe and followed Fido towards the stranger, as curiosity finally had got the better of me, and I wanted to see who this person actually was. I was surprised to see that Chloe was keeping her distance, and her tail was hanging between her legs, as if she was extremely afraid, and I'd never seen her behave this subservient before. When I did approach the stranger, I could not believe what I was actually seeing. This was no human being that was throwing Fido sticks, but a huge hairy creature that looked like a human, only it was covered completely with hair, and it did have a distinct ape-like look to it as well. Body shape and face were definitely human, but there were those discrepancies. You see, the giant-like body of this creature was quite literally colossal. I'm not exaggerating when I say this creature towered at about 10 foot tall, and maybe even over 1,000 pounds, and 5 feet wide, and that's not exaggerating. It really was like meeting King Kong face to face. The creature also possessed very long arms that are so typical of the primate species. Every part of this creature's body was literally thick, burly, sinewy and muscular. It was covered from head to toe with long hazelnut hair, similar in colour to a chocolate Labrador. I did notice that the creature did have a very distinctive bullet-shaped head, very huge shoulders, and no visible neck to speak of. And its hairless face was human-like and leathery, and it had slim lips, a flat nose, very prominent brow ridge, and deep-set golden-brown eyes that twinkled with a warm energy that was very captivating. I don't know why the creature looked so surprised to see me, but it actually did. It had been throwing sticks for my dog, which certainly got my attention, so why was it surprised that I went to check out who he was? The creature had a very warm demeanour and a friendly countenance, but it was desperately shy. I could tell it adored Fido, and the feeling was quite clearly mutual. He even ruffled Fido's hair in front of me with a very affectionate way, and he threw the stick for him, and I watched Fido go tearing after the stick. Suddenly Chloe came into view, and she appeared to be very reluctant and retiring, and she didn't like the idea of getting close to that hairy humanoid at all. So the creature instead lunged towards Chloe with such affection and confident boldness. I watched in awe as it ruffled Chloe's hair very affectionately, and before I knew it, this hairy creature was throwing sticks for Chloe as well, and she was in her element, forgetting her former reluctance for approaching the creature. Gone was the reluctant Chloe, and the exuberant, enthusiastic, rambunctious creature was now bounding around happily after those sticks. I suppose looking back I should have been terrified by this incredible creature, because it would have taken nothing for him to snap my neck if he'd wanted to. He was, without doubt, an apex predator. He was powerful, majestic, strong and lofty. I imagine even the bobcats and mountain lions would have given him a wide berth. I knew instinctively I could trust this creature. How, I don't know why. Perhaps it was the human way he interacted with my dogs, and the way that both my dogs just trusted him so implicitly and were besotted over him. I was soon to realise that he was clearly a likeable character, and even I began to warm to him and feel comfortable in his presence, and he began to warm to me, I'm glad to say. I've never met a human that both my animals loved as much as they loved this extraordinary, mysterious creature. Every day we went to the woods, and I would throw sticks with this hairy creature. My animals just loved it. I tried to tell my parents about the hairy creature in the woods that loved our dogs and enjoyed playing in the woods with us, and my parents were so preoccupied with my sister's recovery and slow progress that I remember my mother saying, "Lovely, dear, how nice." And when I told my father, he was even more vague, and he said, "Well, sweetheart, I'm sure he's a very nice man, but you shouldn't judge someone for having a lot of body hair. It can be a condition, you know. I would tell that neither my parents had ever been listening to a word I said, so I never told anyone else about the strange creature I encountered in the wood. Nobody was interested anyway. To cut a long story short, I'm delighted to tell you that both my sisters made a startling, miraculous recovery from that dreadful poisoning they incurred, and they had no long-lasting negative effects from the disastrous episode with the Coca-Cola, which by negative association they've never been able to drink again. Sadly, we sold our house, and I say sadly because I loved going into the woods and playing with the hairy humanoid. But we moved to a dream, newly built farmhouse in the country where my father managed the dairy herd for his paralysed boss. Sadly, his boss did die 5 years after we moved into the farm, but he did leave our entire family the farm because he wanted the dairy farm to go on thriving long after his death. He loved those cows. He knew that my dad was as passionate about the cows as he had been. My family never looked back because my father was in his absolute element managing our dairy farm, which, believe it or not, I still live in all these years later, on the original farmhouse that was occupied by Ralph, the dairy farmer himself. I do remember when we moved to our farm, my 2 Cocker Spaniels did miss our hairy friend almost as much as I did, and they pined for him so terribly. Finally, I did take them back to the woods, but I think he'd moved on by then, because we never ever saw him again, and my dogs were bitterly disappointed. All these long years later, I realised that the creature I encountered in the woods was a Bigfoot, a hairy man, the Yeti or Sasquatch. I realised that in about the year 2006, when I watched a programme on television called Finding Bigfoot, and I saw how difficult and challenged they were to find the creature that I encountered, and I became very excited because I knew that my dogs and I had had a very special encounter with that hairy humanoid.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.